And thank you all. I'm surprised you're still willing to listen to me anymore, having heard me twice already today. This is short. I literally, between the two webinars before this and the session this morning, I don't have a lot more to say, but I'm going to dig a little bit more into unpack some of the stuff we talked about this morning in a little greater depth for those of you who want to dive into it. So again, a calm image. This time, as Chad noticed, it's Yosemite, a place I've spent a lot of time up in these areas, not backpacking with my buddies. So now that we've got our calm, open mind, it's not about learning. It might seem a funny thing to say at Immersive Learning University, but we don't learn for intellectual self-gratification. We learn to be able to do things we can't do now, right? And so the learning isn't what's important, is the performance as an outcome that's important, which sometimes I use to argue, quit trying to dump it in a course, let's do it with performance support. It's hard to get stuff in the head. And so you should only do it. And in fact, what we heard before, what was Norris's first name? David, from the previous speaker, David, that it's expensive to do good learning. And knowledge, at $10,000 an hour, that's knowledge dump, knowledge test stuff largely. To do more important stuff is going to do well. So you should reserve that for when it really is the only alternative. But I want to talk about learning lessons from game design. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And you've already heard a little bit about me, so I'm not going to go through that in the interest of time because we're behind schedule. So we should finish close to schedule if I'm cracking along. I'm not interested in tarted up drill and kill. I'm not interested in putting a pretty face on top of mindless stuff. I'm not going there. Gamification, as I think I've said in the panel, I don't mind doing it once you've got the skill down and you need the knowledge. Van Marienboer has a really nice instructional design, his 4-component instructional design model, where he sort of, instead of blooms and stuff, which Brenda Suguru did a pretty good job of eviscerating, talks about just, the complex knowledge and the complex problems you have to solve and the knowledge you need to solve them. And he focuses on the problem solving and brings in the knowledge when you need it. And as we talked about those problem-based pedagogies, we put the problem first and then you're motivated to go do that knowledge. But we know how to do that. We can do it when we need to. We do it all too often, and we're sold cheap tools to tart up drill and kill. And we got to stop thinking that that's going to lead to any meaningful outcome, except when we have rote knowledge, and we do that too often. What I am interested in is the deep learning. So I want to tell you a little bit about the Quest game, because we're going to use that to explore those elements I listed. I had the parallel list of elements. I want to go into them a bit more, because if you understand the nuances, it makes you better able to apply them. The Quest game was for kids who grew up without parents, as I mentioned. And they're thrust out on the street. So they have to navigate to succeed. And they have a goal. It's not stated up front, but it's listed in one of the 2 links we have available here. So there's information about the game and help if you need help while you're playing the game, which are 2 different things. So information, the game is to enter the mansion. And that doesn't happen, it turns out, until you have sufficient money in the bank, have a good enough level job, and have a reasonable pre-existing house so that you can now upgrade to the mansion. There were actually different levels you could play at, so the criteria to get in there could get harder and harder to show you had the nuances, but the initial goal was to get in there. And just briefly, it's a goal they have to understand, and it's a goal they have to care about. This is a little bit of exaggeration. It really didn't get into a mansion, but in the game they do, because it shows they've mastered these core elements of simply holding a job, having enough money to live, and finding a stable place to live, which are the types of things they need. Now, it's not easy. As you wander around and look for a job, sorry, we haven't got any jobs at the moment. It's pitched at the right level of challenge. It's frustrating. And we had to tune it. Remember, you tune it into a game to get the right level of challenge, and you can go back and set the parameters to play an easier level until you get it. or you can set it to a harder level once you think you've mastered it. But we tried to mimic, because one of the other things they said this persistence was such an important personal trait to succeed. So we wanted to build that in. Context. There has to be a story setting. And so here we've communicated. I told you the story that this was the more urban setting, and then there was the more rural setting in the other town. And this is only 1/4 of this town, and you navigate around, you go in front of each of these buildings, and when you finally get over here and hit the... Now notice, turns out you're right here. There's no way to go into the middle square, so that's not there. We'll get there. But when you get over here and go right, you'll end up at the next quarter, and then you'll go down in the next quarter, and you'll navigate through the whole city. But there's a context, and if you go into one of those buildings, you'll get a little image of what it looks like inside. So you contextualize the type of cues you have are places to eat, places to sleep, places to spend money and play, and a bank. I mentioned you have to, they told us you need to go to a bank. There's the bank. You have the clues about where you might need to go or might want to explore, looking for clues. And you start out coming out of care, and the original image was the doors open and you're out on the street. Boom. What do I got to do? But as you move around, well, you get clues. Action domain link. So what happens in the game, your choices affect what happens in the game. You saw you have opportunities to have sex. Well, you can choose to have a condom or a clean needle in your satchel of stuff. You don't start with those. You have to go find them and acquire them. And if you choose, so before you get one, if you have an opportunity to have sex or take drugs and you choose to, you don't have any safety. Do you want to continue? Yes. Then you run, there's a probabilistic, it's almost like a slot wheel, that shows you that you're taking a risk and you have some random chance of actually getting sick. Most of the time you'll get sick with, but anyways, I'm bringing in too much. But the action domain links, your choices affect what happens in the game. And you care about them. So here, this isn't the care center. I think this is the community health center. They give away these things free. You care about maybe having this, but even more so, you might care about getting a job if they have a job. There's 2 places to get jobs. At each store, you can ask for a job. And then there's the community employment center where you can ask for a job. You can browse all the jobs available. And there still might be none. And there are different levels. There's a variety. But you care about the things that are happening there. These kids, it was designed for sort of 14, 15-year-olds before they get out into care, but they start realizing they got to face this. And frankly, they're already thinking about sex and drugs because this discussion is happening, because they have self-esteem problems. They don't have parents. They're sort of viewed askance. So one of the ways they overcompensate is by being the cool kid. I know about that sex stuff. I know about the drug stuff. I've tried it. So they're aware. And we wanted to make it relevant to them. There are choices. They can choose to have a cup of coffee or not. They can choose whether to ask for money. They can choose to let a reference. So this is in the care. This was actually Sue Bassler, who came in on our project and was our liaison. And so the kids put her in there. But in the care center, all these are options. They don't always do anything, or they may not always work. When you first start out and you come in here and ask for money, it says you have enough money because you start out with a little bit of money in the bank. But there are choices, and your choices influence what happens. It's direct. So you act on the world the way you normally would. You move up, or you move down, or you go into the building. But we are making direct translations to the choices you make as obviously as possible. When you click on the condom, you're asking to pick it up. Can I have one, please? And we're trying to make it as direct as possible to minimize the cognitive load, so that all your cognitive load is focusing on the task. And there are consequences. If you keep moving around without getting food, you start getting hungrier and hungrier. And you start getting more and more tired. And if you sleep, you'll affect this. If you get food, you'll affect this. And your health is sort of a combination of both of these plus. If you get sick, your health starts going down a little bit. Now, the consequences, if you do the random drugs or sex without protection, you run a risk of getting sick. You can randomly get sick anyways. You can catch a cold. But you'll increase the likelihood if you have these drugs. Sometimes it's just an STD and you can go to the doctor and get treated. Some probability less than that, you can actually get HIV. And it's not curable. It wasn't at this time. And we can't kill them in the game. Their self-esteem is low enough. They just get too sick to continue. And they have to start again. But there are real consequences for choices. And there was a few other random things. We couldn't put everything we wanted into. We had to make clear choices. We wanted them to... Australia at the time still had some racial issues. Civil service, if you went in, and if you were Aboriginal or Asian, you would have more trouble, less likelihood. That was just state of affairs. It's gotten better, somewhat. We couldn't build that in. We wanted them to have that experience and to understand that, and because we wanted the counselors to play it too and understand it from the kids' point of view. We couldn't build that in. So we had to make choices, and we did decide to put in the sex and drugs because we knew from our subject matter experts that this is the troubles that these kids get into, and the kids will literally die in instances from some of this stuff. So we were trying to give them a chance to address it beforehand. And novelty, it wasn't completely deterministic. Good things could happen, like a relative gives you a bag of money, or you get taken out to a meal and your health goes up. And then bad things could happen. You could be mugged. And any money in your pocket. Now, once you opened a bank account, you could start putting bags of money in the bank. We didn't want to do quantitative, so there was bags of money and you got half a bag of money a week if you were a laborer, and there were 3 levels of jobs you could get, and you needed to get the middle level of job and the middle level of housing. There was sort of a shack and an apartment and a house, and you had to move up to these, but as you gradually increased your job, you could afford a nicer place of living, and then you got all this balance. But the issue, as it is in real life, is balancing, is persistence and balancing, and if you got that. And the game, by the way, was not to teach by itself. It was designed to drive conversation with the counselors. Because that's where they're going to learn. Oftentimes, games are a practice environment. They don't give you the concepts. We embedded some of the concepts. There was one place you could go, 2 places you could go, actually. One where they'd give you a quiz about what was the truth, what was the facts, and you could earn a little extra money. Another one was this, you go to a fortune teller, and they gave you hazy cosmic jive hints about what the situation was. Because that's what people do. So these are those elements I talked about made concrete. The elements of novelty and choice and things. These are things you need to bake in. Yes, there was coaching. So you could click on the information link and it would give you some goals of the game and how you moved around. There was help. If you asked for help, it looked at your status. It was a very simple coaching engine. So if you were if you were hungry, it'd say you might want to get some food. If your money was running out, it might say you might want to look for a job, if you didn't have a job, or you might want to look for a better job. Very simple, just looking at those levels. It went further. If you didn't ask for help and you started getting in a certain range, and we defined that range of valuables, it then said, would you like a hint? And if you asked for a hint, it would give you the same hint as if you asked for help. You could ask for it. And if you started, one other thing, one of the problems with Horrible Worlds is people often don't know to go further away. They sort of look under the lamppost where the light is for their keys when actually they might be over here, right? And so one of the hints was you're not exploring enough. If the ratio of a lot of moves without having seen a lot of the world, you could get another hint. It went further, though. If you didn't ask for help, it would ask if you wanted a hint. So here's the whole range. And this is, doing well. And as you got into this sort of danger range, it would ask if you wanted a hint. And if you said no, it wouldn't give it to you. But if you got down here, it would give you the hint. We didn't want them to fail. So we did have coaching that gave them a hint depending on their status. Because that was important in our stuff, and we could do that. We've talked several times about the value. Sufficient practice is something games do really well. They create a world where you're doing a task. Grand Theft Auto, you're stealing cars. Not necessarily a life skill, but you do it again and again, and you get involved in more and more complex gang-related activity. I haven't actually played Grand Theft Auto, so I can't tell you. But the games I have played, you get a lot of practice in battling, or you get a lot of practice in whatever it is. And giving practice, this is actually Dr. Wills, who apparently had to run off. He sent me a message. A lot of practice masked, you actually do better on a test. This is your college experience, right? But 3 days later, it's completely gone. Have you ever seen Father Guido Sarducci's 5-minute university skit, right? That's it. If we space out the learning, you don't actually do as well on the test, but you will do well on the real world test when it counts. It's not dissipated, it's here. And if you reactivate that with mobile or further scenarios spaced out over time, it's going to be there when you need that. Games give you this opportunity to space a fair amount of practice. Go back and play some more. Like I said, people played this game even when they didn't have to. And so they would get the practice. Maybe just till they won, but there was a lot of experience of going around asking for jobs, and built in to succeed, you had to go back to your job and pick up your paycheck. You didn't actually have to go to work every day. You strip away some of the complexities, but you didn't, after a week of game time, you could go back and pick up your check and have to take it to the bank and deposit it. And so but you had to persist in that for a while of maintaining a job and putting money in the bank and paying your rent. And if you could do that, so you got a lot of practice at these principles, the right ones, and balancing all the time and effort you had to invest. Support. The original Colossal Cave adventure, and this really kicked off my whole career. I saw the connection between computers and learning as an undergraduate. But while I was my first job out of college was designing and programming educational computer games. And we started playing this, and that's where I realized we were sort of doing targeted up drill and kill, because that was all you could do on 48K or 32K but I saw that this was a deeper level of thinking. But there were no clues. You basically had this instruction, that was a prompt. Figure it out. And you could try different words, please. This was, the Colossal Cave was and you type things, go west, and it had a subject-verb type of thing. Actually, a verb subject, typically. Go west, take bird, throw bird, whatever it was, you did. And 2 words typically worked, and you ended up exploring, found the end, and solved the puzzle. So it was a branching scenario. In one place, you get in a twisty maze of passages that look all alike, and the only way you could solve it was to drop some of the stuff you'd accumulated, so you figured out which places you'd seen and which you hadn't. So that's essentially no help. Stumble around, which is a bit of a cognitive load until you get the model, and even then you'd have to figure out new words and things to try. This game has a big help document. You play the game, you can go back and read the document, or you go play the game. This game, actually in it, has a tutorial. It gives you saying, try this, move left, move right. Here's how you move left, move right, do it. And then it coaches you. If you find chests, go near them, press this button, it'll open. So it guides you all the way through. There's a whole in-game tutorial to help you get there. Different levels of support that are a choice, but computer games typically have ways of providing support. And they can even have embedded hints, particularly if you're failing. So good computer games have this. If you're going to build up a series of scenarios, being consistent and having support, and as Todd mentioned early on, whatever resources you might have in the real world, patient data, or a sales battle card or information on your client, make it available in the scenario as well. Button, click, bomb, I can review it the same way I would. We don't tend to consider emotion enough. We tend to think about make it happy, fun. You have instructor-led training, smile cards. Did you like the person? What we'll be talking, talks about smile cards, at least having it, do you think this is going to help you at work, which is a slightly more meaningful question. But really, how many of you learn best when you're not motivated? You don't see any hands, do you? How many of you learn best when you're really, really anxious? Actually, a little bit helps. Turns out there's this U-shaped performance curve, the Yerkes-Dodson law, that a little bit of stress actually increases your performance. But the problem is, it drops off really quickly thereafter. See, if you don't calibrate that just right, and it varies for people. To be grossly stereotypical, salespeople are overconfident. That's why it makes them good at what they do. They're impervious to feedback. Sometimes you actually have to make them fail before they're really willing to learn. But other people can be really anxious about learning. Nurses, to use another stereotype, often really don't want to fail, and because they know what they do is important. They want to save lives. So you got to worry about their level of anxiety. And so this is hypothetical, but think about before, they're not motivated, but they're not anxious, unless they've already heard they're going to have to take this course, and then they might be a little bit anxious. But their confidence will probably be no. Or they might be overly confident. You have to knock it down a peg. But then, as soon as you start, give them a motivating example, their motivation should pop up. Okay, I get why this is important. Their anxiety might go up too. I get why this is important, and oh my gosh, I know I don't know how to do this, and this is going to be hard to learn. And their confidence, But we should be addressing those over time. We should be managing anxiety, keeping it below an unproductive level. We should be building, keeping their motivation up until they nail it, and their confidence should be gradually growing. We should be thinking about the emotional side of the equation because we know it impacts learning. This is the conative side of learning. Are you intended investing yourself? Because I'll suggest that you take somebody learning who doesn't believe it's important, and nothing's going to happen. If you bring them in and they're so anxious, their anxiety will overwhelm the effectiveness of the instruction. And I don't know why we don't address this, but we can and should. And Don Norman wrote a whole book, Emotion in Product Design, but it's true for learning design as well. And games get this. They suck you in. They have an enticing story. That some people, a combat game isn't going to be what they want. For some people, fantasy role-playing. For some people, strategy and empire building, whatever. But they've matched the needs, and what we need to do is help our learners understand why this is important, and then they gradually manage. You build confidence. You have just that level of challenge. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And safety. You died. Resurrect. It's a little bit, you resurrect here, but you lose something, or you can resurrect at the entrance to this floor, which means some of the work you've done, you've lost. Or you can resurrect all the way at the beginning at a safe place and lose nothing, but you're going to have to work really hard to get back to this level. But you have choice, and it's safe to fail. So you can experiment. How many of you have ever been in any simulation, whether it was a driver's training simulator or a game, and you said, I'm going to try this and just see what happens. I'm going to fail just because I want to see it. Yeah, we learn by doing this. There was an interesting article recently. Teenage drivers, they start out really safe. And after about 5 months, because they've gotten confident, they just naturally push the limits. And that's when you get the fender benders and tickets and things, because they've gotten confident now, and more confident than their experience would actually justify. But they're pushing the limits. And but if you make it safe to fail, you give them the opportunity to do it. And games do that really well. Balance. We talked about this, and somebody mentioned this. The right level. You start off, and your level of, and this is, not only is it Csikszentmihalyi's flow, but it's also Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. Gradually, as your ability goes up, you can handle more complexity. But too much, too fast, and it's frustrating, too low, and it's boring. And you hit these plateaus, right, as you're learning, until you're your understanding goes through stages. It's first this cognitive stuff, and you have to actively monitor it, which slows you down. And gradually you compile chunks of it away. And every once in a while you have to restructure it because you really had a misconception that finally became clear as you moved on. And you get these plateaus and then these exercises, but you need to manage that flow. And games do this perfectly. This is where they get this, World of Warcraft has this down. How much money have they made by having that exact right level? And they have tutorials and little first initial quests that get you over some of the mechanics. And finally, game developers test. Yeah, they benchmark themselves. I got this straight from a guy, Jeff Johannigman, who had been a professional game developer. Interesting story. He quit game development. He'd written successful games, and his latest game was really successful. And the review said, this game is going to be responsible for more broken marriages and lost sleepless nights. And he thought, I don't want to be doing this. And he quit. And now he's a corporate coach. But game developers test. They focus test. They play test. They usability test. They naive player test. They unit test, they integration test, they configuration test, they do regression test, and they crash test. They hire people who are the most evil, twisted minds they can to see if they can break the game. And they test platform compatibility because here's the thing. When their game is released, if there's a bug in it, their sales, and that gets out, it makes it unplayable or really damages playability, they may have completely, remember that one successful game pays for 20 games? They may have just become one of the 20. And they don't like that. They test content and performance and stability. They test and retest gold master candidates. And if we expect the game to affect the player, we test that too. Dov Jacobson. Do not think you're going to get it right the first time. Build into your schedules, your budget, your processes, and your plans that you're going to tune it. And one of the most important things is, if you're doing coding, is to use constants. Don't use programmers or animators. Use software engineers who understand the notion of separating out the variables from the code. So if you need to tune it, you can change the value here and it'll change it everywhere it's referenced. If you have to change it everywhere it happens, you will miss some. And then you end up with utter higgledy-piggledy, to use the technical term. That's it. Thank you very much. Thanks. Questions? Please.
So one of the challenges, I think, of the question is, how do you keep the failure from being more fun than success?
Short answer, you design it that way. There was many cases. I remember we used to talk about this way back when we were designing the Creature Creator and Facemaker and those games in the early 80s. Because there were some games were spectacularly more visually and auditorily engaging to because it had this lovely explosion, and you got the right answer. Say, good job. Or you got the little dancing rabbit. And explosions were far more fun than dancing rabbits to most of these people. So you absolutely have to ensure that that's the case. Failure, some of them have this dun, 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 but have a penalty. You lose a little bit from where you were. You don't get to immediately restart if you want to avoid people failing on purpose. So let me ask this question of you. When you go back to your workplace, I don't know if it's Friday or Monday, and you start thinking about doing this in your workplace, just mentally put yourself there. I'm going to start breaking this into our process. Oops. What's the first barrier that comes to mind? Maybe we can crowdsource a good answer. Design time. I have a statement that good design doesn't take any longer, because you have to still understand the analysis and stuff, but with a caveat. The caveat is there will be some shift in your process, some time to bake that into your process. But once you get to it, this thinking is similar enough that it doesn't take any more time. It's just you have to start thinking differently first. And you have to, sell that to the management and get practiced at it. Because at first it's going to be kind of explicit. Once it gets compiled, as you're gathering the information in your analysis, it starts falling into place. With one caveat, that extra tuning. Too many people design a learning thing, and if I build it, it is good. How many people here have heard of Atul Gawande? Heard of him? He wrote a fabulous book called The Checklist Manifesto. He was a physician, and he was interested in helping the developing world, and he found out that the medical facilities had a survival rate of about 20% on surgery. That's not very good. And he looked into it, and it wasn't because these were life-threatening things. It was because the doctors, for a variety of cultural and resource and overload reasons, were missing fundamental steps. And he hypothesized that if they could just get those steps right, we might be able to raise survivability rates. So he built a checklist just to address those sort of core things about cleanliness and sanitation that even well-meaning doctors would skip for a variety of reasons. But it wasn't right the first time. He tested it and refined it and got rid of it, changed the wording, made sure. When he finished, people who used that, the survivability rate was 80%. Totally flipped the numbers. But he didn't get there by making it once and releasing it. He tuned it. How many of you take your things, go out and release it without testing? Nobody wants to bet it. How many of you test it several iterations? I don't expect, Michael Allen's SAM model has 3 iterations at each of 3 stages. I understand that. But I'm just going to say at least test a time or two and do that. So that may affect your time a little bit, Alicia, but yeah.
I just mean the time that our stakeholders give us to design. There's no such thing as that ratio of time that the speaker just spoke about.
I understand. But bake it in, sell it to them, and because you'll get, actually early on, getting rid of the big problems. And Jacob Nielsen was mentioned, I think, over our lunch conversation among some of us. He does usability for the web, and he's done stuff on heuristic usability, which is just sort of your usability testing on the cheap. And he says if you iterate between a little user testing and a little expert review, boom, 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 you can get 80% of the problems done in about 3 iterations or 5 iterations. With a very few amount of testing and very few people involved, you can get most of the problems. But you do have to do that iteration, and getting different perspectives helps you hone those out. Please.
Looking at K-12, would you recommend game design at any level? And if so, what are some of the sweet spots looking forward in terms of age and in terms of subject matter?
In the book I'm just reading on learning on interface design for learning experiences, she's got a number of examples. There are fabulous results with just 4-year-olds and iPads learning stuff. There are great apps out there. So I think all the way along. One of the most powerful ones came up earlier, having the kids design games. Lloyd Reber did some wonderful stuff at the University of Georgia about that. But to particularly develop rote skills, like there's some games to help kids learn to form letters properly, so their writing is pretty good. And some of the phonics and math facts, the stuff that they have to have cold. I still believe you need to know the multiplication tables. I don't want you to learn. I'd rather you learn estimation than long division multiplication, but so that you can get the right order of magnitude. If a calculator, if you miskey, is that the answer, or how would you know you got the wrong answer if you miskeyed? You need to be able to estimate. But increasingly, we should be using calculators for stuff and figure out how to use that in the classroom. But yes, games for kids, and the principles are get the storyline that develops it, and don't assume that the game can do everything. Make sure the teacher's in the loop or the parent's in the loop.